Good morning. Welcome. Of course, if you didn't subscribe yet, subscribe, share with your friends. If you could subscribe twice, do that if there's some way. Let's spread the learning. We're starting a new Chumash this week. We actually started on Shabbos after Mincha. Shmos, second book. The Ma'amer we're covering today is a dialogue between Moshe Rabbeinu and Hashem. Hashem is sending Moshe Rabbeinu to Egypt, take the Jewish people out, and let's end their slavery. And Moshe Rabbeinu is less than enthusiastic about going, which obviously he's not arguing with Hashem in the literal sense, but there's a subtext that's going on over here. Moshe Rabbeinu knows that if he takes the Jewish people out of Egypt, he's not the final redeemer. Mashiach has to come from the tribe of Yehuda, descendant of King David, at least from Yehuda, and Moshe Rabbeinu is from Levi. So if he does it, there's going to have to be another Golus afterwards, in theory, another exile, which then Mashiach will come and end the exile totally. So for this reason and other reasons, Moshe Rabbeinu is essentially saying, I'm not the right one for the job, I have an older brother, I don't speak well. And to his argument of, I don't speak well, because Moshe Rabbeinu had a stutter, which is a story unto itself, the Eibusher responds, Hashem told him, Mi sam peh, who gave a mouth to a person. In other words, what do you think? Who made people to speak in the first place? I did, so you'll be okay. So we have to understand this, so the Torah asks the question. Moshe Rabbeinu obviously knew that. What's this whole conversation? Moshe Rabbeinu told Hashem, I can't speak, and Hashem responded, who do you think makes people speak? What's the question? Obviously Moshe Rabbeinu knows Hashem could fix it in a second. And what's the response from Hashem? What news is he telling him? I'm the one that makes people speak. Newsflash, what's this whole thing? So to explain this, the Alter Rebbe tells us that there's a Kabbalah Sefer called Sefer HaTmuna. And in the introduction to the third section of the Sefer, he says that this world is really the second Shemitah, second sabbatical. There is a set of 7 that we know in Halacha. When we're in Eretz Yisrael, we have 7 years that we could work the land, 6 years actually, and the 7th is a sabbatical. And agriculturally, we can't do anything to the land. Spiritually, on a deeper level, this represents 7,000 years. The first 6,000, Kabbalah tells us the world exists, and the 7th one, it gets destroyed, which means a lot of other things, such as Mashiach will come definitely by the 7th millennia, which is the beginning of 6,000, God willing today, even earlier. The idea, however, is that it represents a change of this world. Now, says the Sefer HaTmuna, that the world that we live in now is the second set of this 7. Before our world, we had another world. Now, these worlds come from Midas of Hashem. Good morning. And the first one was from Chesed. It was a very kind world. And the second set of 7, which is the world that we live in now, our reality, is from Gvura. We know the 7 Midas of Hashem. The first one's kind. The second one is Gvura. And as a result of that, we have a unfortunate history of a destruction of the first Beis HaMikdash, destruction of the second Beis HaMikdash, suffering, exile, and so on, because there is a Gvura component to the origin of this world, which is really 2.0. It's the second world that we have here. Okay, that's what Kabbalah says. So our world that we're in now is really the second world. There was a world before us. Okay. Now, there are other Kabbalists that came after the Tmuna, later Kabbalists, and they say really there's 7 Midas, so there are 7 worlds total. We're number 2. There's another 5, right? 2 plus 5 according to most opinions. So there's 5 more worlds that come after us. Now, the Arizal argues on this, and the Arizal says no. There's just 2, and we're the second one. Not only that, but this second world that we are, just to clarify, the first world was not a physical, material world. There was no heaven and earth. There were no physical entities. There's no daimim tameach chaim medaber, which means there are no minerals, no vegetation, no animals, no people. It was a spiritual concept. Okay, so we have this different sources in Kabbalah, which the Arizal does not agree with, and those sources seem to imply that the world that existed before us was a physical world. And Chassidus takes on the way that Arizal explains that there was a world before us which was spiritual. What is this other world? Says the Alter Rebbe, it's known as the world of Toihu. This world was a world of chaos. Briefly, when Hashem created the world, every stage, and including in human existence, there's a giver and a receiver. Call it energy and a processor, light and a receptacle. And that's how the world operates. In this original world, which was destroyed, or it didn't last, which is called chaos, the chaos of it was that there was way too much light, too much revelation, too great of an energy, commensurate with the kalim that are going to process the tools, the vessels that are processing it. And therefore, it busted. If you put too much air in the balloon, it's going to bust. Too much water or too fast in the cup, it's going to bust. You can't handle it. So what was supposed to create and sustain a world ended up being fragmented, crashing, and all the pieces of this very holy 1.0 world ended up in our world, which is a topic for a different time, but that world was a spiritual world and it crashed. Says the Alter Rebbe a very fascinating thing, that in this second world that we live in, there are two neshamas, two souls, that made it here from the first world. And those are Chanoich and Moshe. Their soul really emanates, really belongs to the world of Tayu, which is a spiritually very intense world, much more spiritual than ours, which that's why it didn't last. But they came here. And he shows from the various psukim, for example, it says, Chanoich, vayishalech Chanoich es halikim. Chanoich went with Hashem. He went means he already went, past tense. He's already been here, or he's already been in existence. And he's here. And thanks to him being here, he was able to change the situation because the world was so corrupt in the times of Noach. Instead of the world ending up in Toyu Vavayu, going back to the original state of nothingness and void, and just zero, a delete of the world, that didn't happen thanks to Chanaich's influence, or his spirituality, or his level that was here. And instead, the flood came to just renew, be retire, elevate, purify the world. And Noach and his family survived, and there's a continuation of the world. This is because of Chanaich's neshama that comes from Toyu, so he brought with him that ability. The second neshama, which comes from Toyu, that ends up in our world of Tikkun, is Moshe. Moshe Rabbeinu's name, says Alter Rebbe, as we know from Chumash, Minamayim Mishisiu. When Basya took him out of the Nile River, the name that he was given was, I drew him from the water. His original name was Tuvia. According to most opinions, the Gemara says, they saw that his mother saw that he was good. That his face was illuminated with light. The whole house was illuminated as a result of it. He was called Tuvia. But Basya, who took him out of the water, called him Moshe, because I took him out of the water. I drew him out. Drawing out is he's drawn from somewhere. From where? From Toyu. And because of that, he had the ability, because he was from Toyu, he was exceedingly humble. And because of Moshe Rabbeinu's level of humility, which Torah testifies, that Moshe Rabbeinu was extremely humble from anyone that ever existed. There's no one on earth that is as humble as Moshe Rabbeinu. But because of that, he was able to take us out of Mitzrayim and to give us the Torah, to bring down the Torah. Okay, so we know, before we have this question of how come Hashem tells this conversation between Moshe Rabbeinu is about, Moshe Rabbeinu says, I can't speak it. Hashem says, who do you think makes people speak? It's obvious. The whole question and answer is perplexing. And we give an introduction about this concept of another world, multiple worlds. So this takes from the Arizal that there's only two, we're the second one, And the first one was not a material world, it's very spiritual. It's called Toyu. That chaotic world, chaos because it wasn't sustainable, is extremely spiritual and very, very godly. And there's two souls from there that ended up in our world, Chanoich and Moshe. And thanks to them, we have a world. Because of Chanoich, the world was not totally destroyed. And because of Moshe, we got out of Mitzrayim, and the Torah was brought down and so on.
I thought Adam HaRishon was the first human.
He was. The neshama existed on some level from before.
The neshama,
of these
not
two.
the actual. Not the actual person.
Correct. Okay. Once we're on the topic of Toyu and Tikkun, it says like this: Hahefresh, meaning hahefresh between Toyu and Tikkun. The difference between Toyu and Tikkun. Yadua be'etz Chaim. It's known in Eitz Chaim, a general concept, how the format or the structure, the makeup of Toyu versus Tikkun is, and it's very interesting. You didn't have format or structure of the various different spheres in Toyu, where you have it in Tikkun. Rather, all they were dots. You have Chesed, Gvura, Tiferes. It's not a proper structure where they can interact and coexist. The spheres were not divided into specific details in length and in width. Rather, there was one general point in an exceeding summarized, condensed way, which is a problem. Zu chesed, v'zu gvura, etc. In addition to the fact that it was extremely condensed and concentrated, just a point, chesed, gvura, it wasn't expanded on in the length and in the breadth. In addition, the gam, hayu asa sfiris tachazeh, each one was one under the other. Shayu mifuradim zemizeh, they were separate one from another. Shachesed hayu b'fnei atzmei, or gvura b'fnei atzmei, v'hayu miskalim zemizeh, they could not become included one from the other. And that's why there were only points. Okay. So Tohu world says the following. We have many different spheres. Okay, let's take two main spheres, or two main midas. Chesed and Gvura. These are two opposite attitudes. Chesed is kind, giving, loving, and Gvura is discipline, severity, and withholding. Okay, the ability to say no, the ability to stop, and so on, which is necessary. Now, these two are in two different directions, right, left, and they do two very different things. In a healthy way, they could coexist. You could have kindness, but only to good people, only in a responsible way, only in a proper measure. So you're using some gvura to keep your chesed in check. And the same thing is gvura. Sometimes you have to say no, you have to be disciplined, but it has to be in a sustainable way. You can't just destroy whatever you're trying to keep in check. That ability to take two opposites and work together, the right amount of chesed, and give some gvura to it, or use gvura, put some chesed in it, is only in tikkun. Why? Because the way they're set up, they're parallels. But the way that it is in the world of toyu, they're dots. So you have chesed, gvura, tiferes. When you're at chesed, there is no gvura. Gvura is under it. When you get to gvura, there's no chesed, it's on top of it. One is side by side, so we could somehow take a little bit of this together. When they're stacked, you're here, you don't have any of this. If you're this way, so they all either lead into each other or work together. And that's another reason, not just because the was too much, but in Toyu, they can't coexist. They're not available. When one is there, the other one is not there. But when you're in the world of Tikkun, it starts to have a format, a structure. The Chachma nivna parts of Abba. From Chachma is built the parts of known as Abba, which is father, or masculine, or giving. Umevav Ktzaves, and from the six sides, parts of Zoh, which are the seven midas known as Zoh, Zer Anpin. That process is that the spheres now come down into myriads of details, a lot of details. And really, when you have the details, you could work together. Two opposites, you could find common ground, you could see which part of the chesed you're going to use, which detail I'm going to use. I'm going to say no, but I'm not going to kill the guy. because you have a detail of gevura that you're using. I'm going to give them, but I'm not going to let them be totally, what do you call it, taking advantage or abusive of it. I'm going to be very, very loving, but I'm going to give them their space. When you have the details, you could have both. When it gets into details, you now have tes pa'amim tes, 9 times 9. Ubechol echad reish teich seif. And in each one of these, you have a beginning, a middle, and an end. So 9 times 9 is 81, right? And each one of these spheres, because we're not using malchus, right? So you have chesed, gvura, tiferes, netzach, hoid, yesod, plus chacham bin adas. So you have 9 times 9, because each one has the details, every detail that's there, so that's 81, times 3, because each one of these spheres have a top, a middle, and a bottom. So what's 81 times 3? 243, thank you. And then you have, he adds to that, the Hechasadim. And there's the 5 levels of kindnesses, or 5 strands of kindness. Hamagdilim, but it's more than strands, there's 5 types of Chasadim. Hamagdilim, which expand on it. So 243 plus the 5 Chasadim is 248. 248 is the amount of limbs that we have in the positive mitzvahs. That's what you have in the world of Tikkun. Instead of having just dots, you're able to expand on it into details. Once you expand on it, you have each one the way it is comprised of all the other types. And you could multiply it, because you have the top, middle, and the bottom, and you add the Hechasadim to it. You don't have a whole structure, you have a body, you have a partzuf, which in Sfiris that means that you have a workable process that could be sustained and give to others in a healthy way. It's not going to explode. That's the advantage of the way Tikkun, the way Hashem created the world of Tikkun, and the way that we have human beings and physicality and so on and so forth. V'gam nasa skalus masfiris zumizu, and also you now have the inclusion of spheres one from the other. So now we have this ability that each sphere could be contained in the other one. Chesed can go into Gevura, Gevura can go into Chesed. I could be very kind and loving to a child, but at the same time I could say no if he's taking a knife, right? I could be Gevuradik in a kind way. Doesn't mean I'm going to beat him up, but I'm going to say no even though he's crying. The mashal for these two bechinos, these two levels of Torah and Tikkun, you understand this also in regards to the keches of the nefesh of the person. The 248 keches that we have in our soul, they get enclosed in the 248 limbs of the body. It's very specific. There is this koyach, let's call it an energy of vision, which allows a person to see. That koyach goes into the eye. It's not going into the finger, and it wouldn't even work if it goes into the finger. You have to have both. You have to have the ur and the keli. You have to have the light, which is that type. You have to have the keli that could process that type. The koyach hashmiya ba'izan.